It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. The two candidates in the North Carolina's unresolved state Supreme Court race, the State Board of Elections, and other interested parties in the ongoing legal dispute all faced a deadline yesterday to submit opening briefs before a federal trial judge hearing in that case. Meanwhile, the election board's Democrat candidate Allison Riggs, the Democrat Party of North Carolina, and left-of-center activist groups all urged the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to step into the dispute. Without Fourth Circuit intervention, U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers will decide whether to block a process that the state courts spelled out resolving the election between Riggs and Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin. As many as 5,700 of Griffin's original 65,000 challenged ballots remain in dispute. The election board has indicated it believes no more than 1,675 ballots could be affected. We are still waiting to land on a final number for that. Griffin's latest filing in the Myers court case criticized the movants in the case, who asked Myers to block the state courts from following the ruling in the case. His lawyers wrote, quote, "Movants disagree with North Carolina courts about state law. They argue that North Carolina has changed the election rules after the election, but that's not what the court said. They held that the plain language of the state constitution barred voters who had never resided in North Carolina from voting in state elections. And the North Carolina Supreme Court found that the state election code required overseas voters to provide photo identification with their ballots. As part of this remedy, the court provided a 30-day cure period for those voters to fix the issue. The State Board of Election disagreed, urging Myers to, quote, bring this protracted and ill-conceived litigation to end. Lawyers for the State Board of Election wrote, quote, in this case, the North Carolina state courts have ruled on certain state law claims and ordered the State Board of Elections to implement a remedial process that could result in altering the 2024 election results for a seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Now this court must decide whether those state court orders comply with federal law. The board respectfully submits that they do not. So obviously a lot of legal back and forth with something that we have been tracking for many weeks at this point, well, many months at this point, if we're being honest, as we sit here this morning. The legal challenges, the legal battles do in fact continue. We are waiting for some more movement either out of the Fourth U.S. Circuit, other federal courts as well. A lot of moving parts still. We're keeping an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:08, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We're tracking details on a new audit this morning as it relates to the North Carolina Department of Commerce. To get some details on that this morning, Theresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Teresa, we've got a brand new auditor and state auditor, Dave Bolick. We've covered some of the audits out of his office over the last couple of weeks and months now. We've got this new one this morning. We're talking about some pretty eye-popping figures. Walk us through the details.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Nick. So this audit we're going to talk about is from the North Carolina Department of Commerce. It's part of a bigger audit. I'm just going to preface that really quickly. So State Auditor Bolick did the 2024 statewide single audit. Of course, they do it every year. And what they did was audit about 22 programs covering a little over $25 billion in spending from funds awarded by the federal government. So, it's not just the state government. Now we're focusing on the federal government, which is another big deal. So in total, North Carolina spent a little over $36 billion in federal awards from 618 programs, managed by 103 different state entities. And that includes Department of Commerce. So the auditor's office found about $8.5 million in question costs and 11 total findings. According to State Auditor Bolick, most of those question costs would be attributed to the Department of Commerce. And this is a repeated problem with this department. So what they found this year is that they incorrectly used $8.5 million of unemployment insurance funds. And what they did is they charged those expenditures to the wrong time frame allotted for each reward. So there's just a bunch of them they went through. I won't go through all of them, but specifically 8 expenditures totaling a little over $8 million were charged to an award in the consortium only automation period. It's another big word for the department. Also 13 expenditures totaling roughly $15,000 were charged to an award before it even started. And what they were doing is they're blaming this on staffing shortages, which they were also recognized in the previous audit from the previous year for same different issues on, that we don't have the staffing. So it's been an ongoing issue. We can get into a little more of the report in a moment, but it just seems like it's wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah, you talk about this $8.5 million, which is one of the more eye-popping figures coming out of this audit. And Theresa, I guess one of the big issues at question here is this: since this is money that is coming from the federal government, these audits are required by the feds. If it's deemed that the state of North Carolina did not use the money correctly, did not audit the money correctly, or in this case seems like charged it incorrectly in terms of the allotted periods of time, that money potentially could have to be paid back to the federal government, which would put North Carolina taxpayers on the hook.
That's correct. Yeah, they could most definitely be sending this money back. Like I said, it's been an ongoing issue, and yeah, you might, see some of your taxes go up as a result of this. So, there's been a definite lack of oversight. So we mentioned repeated problems. This department also didn't adequately monitor $55 million in federal funds that were designated for the employment and training programs for adults, dislocated workers, and youth who have some barriers for finding employment. They went through all different procedures. And like I said, this is nothing new because they found the same issue in the 2023 statewide single audit. They found the department didn't adequately monitor about $58 million in federal funds for the same programs. So they're down a little bit to $55 million from 58. That's still a big number that you're not monitoring this correctly. And again, they claim they don't have the workforce to help monitor this, but they're rectifying it, we hope.
Well, Theresa, that begs my next question. When you've got a state agency that is year in, year out told, hey, you've got a problem, and we're talking about significant amount of money, $57 million in 2023, $55 million in 2024. At what point does somebody else step in if this agency is incapable of keeping a close eye on these funds? I don't know that we're necessarily indicating that there's any fraud within that money, but if it's not being watched, I guess it opens up the possibility for some nefarious actors to be taking advantage of the state and or the federal government.
Yeah, you're correct. I mean, this all harkens to, it's on the same wavelength as like an NCOR, where maybe you're going to have an oversight committee hearing what's going on within this department and other departments who come under the statewide single audit, who have repeated violations, if you will, every year of the same thing happening, saying, yeah, we know, we're sorry. This is just like in court. We're sorry. We know there's a problem. We're working on it. We're fixing it. We take responsibility. You hear the same thing the next year, but it's a lot of money. It's also federal from reporting to the federal government. And it's also possibly taxpayers, as you say, are going to be on the hook for this money. So it is definitely an important issue, one that maybe should be examined more closely.
Theresa, we've got some additional details this morning on this audit of the Commerce Department. Where can folks get those?
They can head on over to carolinajournal.com.
Theresa Opeka joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time to get a look at traffic on your Tuesday morning. A look at the roadways with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. House Bill 432, titled Property Tax Relief Study, unanimously passed the North Carolina House of Representatives last week and would examine ways to cut property tax bills for some North Carolinians who struggle to keep up with spiking home values. The legislation now headed to the Senate. The bill would direct the Revenue Loss Study Committee to examine existing property tax relief programs and determine whether changes are needed to reduce the burden on certain vulnerable homeowner populations and what the impact would be on local governments. According to Joe Harris, who's the fiscal policy analyst for the John Locke Foundation, said, quote, since the pandemic, North Carolina home values have skyrocketed by a whopping 67.1%, creating concern among homeowners about the affordability of their property taxed bill. Individuals on fixed incomes, such as the elderly and disabled, are particularly burdened by higher property taxes. Harris offered an explainer of the current property tax plan available in North Carolina and how to apply. The current property tax system outlined in Chapter 105, Article 12 of General Statute requires all real and personal property to be listed, appraised, and taxed annually unless specifically exempt. Local governments set property tax rates each year and use revenue to fund public services. Certain properties, such as those owned by nonprofits or qualifying veterans or elderly, may be exempt from property taxation under certain state programs. In the House, lawmakers voted unanimously 110-0 to authorize the study into whether increasing income thresholds and exclusion amounts, as well as redefining income eligibility or restructuring deferred tax programs, would help. The study would also look at whether capping annual property taxes, allowing installment payments, would cut down on the burden for some of the targeted groups. However, property taxes are critical for local services, so the committee will study how making these changes would impact local governments across the state of North Carolina and their revenues. The findings and any proposed legislative changes are due to be reported to the 2026 General Assembly. So this work will go on through the rest of this year and bill will be reported to the General Assembly, presumably, probably about a year or so from now. A recent report from the Tax Foundation ranks North Carolina as having the 14th lowest property tax burden in the nation. Within the state, Northampton County has the highest effective property tax rate, while Jackson County has the lowest. As I mentioned, the bill now moves its way to the North Carolina Senate for consideration. Property taxes, as Joseph Harris reported, continue to skyrocket across the state, 67% in terms of an increase for home values since COVID. Some big-time numbers there. You can read some additional details on this legislation this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com, where it's now 5:24. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Keeping an eye on your money this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, we've got yet another audit out of State Auditor Dave Bolick's office, this time the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, NCDPS. And I guess the headline really says it all. They didn't fully understand some of the requirements behind the money they were getting. To walk us through those details this morning, Theresa Opeka, carolinajournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Theresa, pretty strong headline there. What are the details?
Sure, Nick. Thanks so much. So, yeah, that was the warning coming out of State Auditor Bolick's office. And again, it's part of the 2024 statewide single audit. So what auditors did, they reviewed cash receipts and disbursement reports in all 12 quarterly federal financial reports and found the amounts reported did not agree with the department's accounting records. And this is going to Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Matthew reports. So here we go again. We're mentioning all this stuff again when it comes to those hurricanes that were almost a decade later. So what they said is reporting inaccurate CDBG, that's Community Development Block Grant, financial data prevents HUD from monitoring the federal funds used to help the communities provide housing and expand economic opportunities for low and moderate income families. So Management from Department of Public Safety said the federal financial report was prepared using amounts from HUD's disaster report grant reporting system. It's a mouthful. And the amounts were not reconciled to DPS's accounting records due to a lack of understanding of the reporting requirements. This is what they told the auditors, that they did not understand the reporting requirements. And so, basically auditors recommended that maybe you should understand the requirements, including reconciling the amounts for accuracy. DPS agreed with the findings and recommendations and said their controller's office and North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery, better known as NCORE, were unaware of changes in reporting requirements, and management's currently seeking some guidance from HUD to better understand those requirements. So, yeah, they just did not understand what they were looking at. That's not good.
No, I guess trying to plead ignorance there, but I mean, just looking at one of these specifically, it says 4 Hurricane Matthew disaster reports had underreported receipts of almost $9 million, and disbursements were underreported by over $13 million. Teresa, that's $22 million that we're talking about there. That is not a small sum of money at all.
No, it is not. I mean, you don't want any sum of money to be reported correctly, but when you're talking that many millions of dollars, I mean, if you don't understand something, maybe, you can ask a question. Whether they say there's no stupid question, so go ahead and ask. I mean, but when you're handling federal money and how this all relates to, hurricanes and hurricane victims and hurricane recovery, it's just not a good look for that department.
Now, when some of the other audits that we've talked about earlier this morning and yesterday, there was some discussion taking place that, or the past audits had shown a similar situation unfolding where the same department has been dinged year over year in these statewide single audit that is conducted, and the same problem continued to exist. Is that the same situation over at DPS, or because those requirements just changed, it hasn't been an issue in the past?
Well, they've had some, they were the subject of past audits from this past December and April of 2022, not related to this specific, when you're talking about these guidelines, but they have been the subject of other audits. So it's not like it's their first time at the rodeo at this. So.
Now, I guess it's probably important to maybe broaden the scope a little bit on this, Teresa. There's a lot of discussion going on in Washington, D.C. right now. We've heard about the Department of Government Efficiency. It's been on folks' news feeds now for the last couple of months. Here in North Carolina, the aptly named DAVE Act has been introduced and is working its way through the General Assembly, talking about government efficiency in North Carolina. It seems like with everything that we've been covering over the last few days, this level of efficiency and understanding processes and making sure that things are accounted for correctly is very much needed across North Carolina's government.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It always has been, but you're seeing the light shining on this really, really brightly, now following the Trump administration. Now you've got Auditor Bullock and the NCGA, General Assembly taking a look at all of this and getting some bills hopefully passed. And yeah, it's truly, it's a good thing to shine the light on all of this and not waste money, because, it is all, it boils down to it. It's taxpayer money. You and I and everybody else, we're paying for all of this. So you want to make sure everything is being managed correctly.
No question about that. Teresa, you've got some additional details in the story this morning. Where can folks find those?
And they can head on over to carolinajournal.com.
Theresa Opeka joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:29, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
536, you're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We've got some interesting news on tariffs this morning. As the leading exporter of sweet potatoes in the United States, North Carolina faces potential economic strain. This as the Trump administration has increased tariffs across the board in the ongoing trade war, placing farmers in a challenging position. Steve Troxler, who is the commissioner of the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, told the Carolina Journal, quote, "Sweet potatoes are a big crop for North Carolina. In fact, our farmers produce over 60% of the total U.S. market. Access to export markets are significant for the North Carolina sweet potato industry, with exports totaling over $129 million in 2024. European countries, Canada, and Mexico represent top buyers for that very popular crop. North Carolina has been the leader in sweet potato production since 1971, producing 64% of the nation's crop. The largest producers are in Sampson, Nash, Wilson, and Johnston counties. The sweet potato was named the state vegetable back in 1995 by the North Carolina General Assembly. The agricultural commissioner said, quote, "I am encouraged that European leaders are discussing trade deals with the Trump administration. North Carolina has been able to grow its production because of exports to Europe, so these European countries are key for sweet potato producers." Experts have outlined several key lessons that can be learned from the current trade war and the impact on tariffs on the sweet potato farmers and exporters. Michelle Granger, who is the executive director of the North Carolina Sweet Potato Commission, didn't know that existed, said, quote, One is that agriculture can inadvertently become collateral damage in broader trade disputes, as happened with the soybean industry. While we understand the need to confront unfair trade practices, blanket tariffs can cause significant hardship for farmers, especially those that depend on exports to grow and diversify their markets, as well as added cost pressures on inputs that come from other countries. These costs either need to be absorbed into already minuscule margins or passed on to the consumer, who are already feeling the pressure on their pocketbooks, and that ultimately translates into lower consumption and lost sales. Predictability is another critical factor in the stability of the trade market. Without predictability, disruptions in the production process can lead to gaps or backups in the supply chain, ultimately causing a product shortage. Granger continued by saying, quote, "Sudden shifts in trade policy disrupt planning, investments, and supply chain relationships. Going forward, we hope to see more strategic, coordinated trade policy that includes agricultural voices at the table from the start, so that growers are protected but not isolated from the global opportunities available." A growing percentage of the North Carolina sweet potato crop is exported mainly to Europe and China. Last month, China announced plans to impose a 10% tariff on North Carolina exports, which would include fruits and vegetables. In addition, China tariffed on U.S. goods were recently increased to 124%. According to Kelly Lester, who is the policy analyst over at the Center for Food, Power, and Life at the John Locke Foundation, reported, quote, "If those trading partners respond with retaliatory tariffs, which China already has, or shifts to other suppliers, farmers could face a sharp decline in demand. The sweet potato market has already been squeezed by rising input costs and labor challenges. Adding trade instability to the mix could drive prices down and make it even harder for growers to stay profitable. For many farm families, especially in eastern North Carolina, this isn't about the economy and economics, it's about survival." Some very interesting stats there on the sweet potato industry. It is the largest state that produces North Carolina is sweet potatoes across the nation. You can get some additional details and read some more quotes this morning by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com, or it's now 5:41. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are continuing to track audits this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got a new one this morning out of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. To walk us through those details this morning, Theresa Opeka, carolinajournal.com, joins us. Theresa, I'm looking at the headline here, $106.5 million worth of federal funding that wasn't adequately monitored over at HHS. What's going on there?
Sure. Good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me. So, yeah, that's a pretty big number. It's coming out of the North Carolina Office of State Auditor's 2024 statewide single audit. And they focused in on the Health and Human Services, where they didn't adequately monitor that $106.5 million in federal funding. And it was passed to sub-recipients for providing substance abuse prevention, treatment, and recovery services, and also addressing the opioid abuse crisis. They also, another figure too, they questioned over 21,000 in medical assistance program, better known as Medicaid payments the department made to providers. It was based on inaccurate information eligibility determination. So some stuff to break down there. There's a little bit more as well. Regarding that inadequate monitoring, so what it says here is the the division, they didn't complete monitoring activities and on-site visits for visits that include for Medicaid direct beneficiaries. And they also, there was more when they broke down the numbers. It says some of these also, it was for local management entity managed care organization, LME, MCO, and financial assistance contract entities. They received 40.4 million in substance abuse funds and 37.5 million in opioid abuse funds. So they went through all of that. They didn't adequately monitor all of those. And as the auditor's office says, inadequate monitoring increases the risk federal funds may not be used according to what the federal government requires. And they may have to, send some of that money back. This was also a recurring finding, was previously reported in the 2023 statewide single audit. So, a lot of that stuff going on. It's also a repeated problem. And they said, the department says, yep, they are making other changes. They're working on some things and providing additional training. But again, we mentioned yesterday with the Department of Commerce, it's like an ongoing issue. And so no different for Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to mention. I mean, it feels like Groundhog's Day. We just talked about this yesterday with the Commerce Department, another entity within the state receiving large sums of federal monies, Theresa, that are not following these federal guidelines. Yesterday it was a decent chunk of change, but this morning we're talking over $100 million. Now, obviously, again, not indicating necessarily that there's any fraud there, but if there was major fraud, that money would have to be paid back out of the state coffers, would it not?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal when you get down to it.
Now, when we covered the Commerce Department audit yesterday, we had the Commerce Department coming out and saying, yep, we understand that there are these issues. These are some of the things we're changing. We had some key staffing positions that were not filled. Did we get any response from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services as to what they thought on this audit or any potential changes that they're going to be making?
Yeah. So for that specific, the monitoring of what we just mentioned, they told auditors they are making changes as they clarify staff roles, refine their processes, and train newly hired contract administrators. And they're doing some other work as well. So they said they did agree with it and the findings and the recommendations. But they also said the monitoring plan was not implemented due to competing priorities and changes to the monitoring procedures that were not reflected in the monitoring plan. They also said there were so many different Medicaid people who qualified for Medicaid under Medicaid expansion that there was just an unprecedented influx of service-related dollars. So it basically seemed like there was too much information for them to handle. It's if you read between the lines.
It's interesting as I read through some of the details on this story over at CarolinaJournal.com this morning, Theresa. A lot of this deals with money that is awarded to sub awards is what they call it, individuals in which DHHS essentially is funneling the money through. So these are outside entities that are taking in this federal monies under this state department that they're not, in some cases, not monitoring the money at all.
Right. That's correct. Even some, like we mentioned about deficiencies in Medicaid eligibility determination process. And I think they did this in the last statewide audit. They were putting the blame on some of the county offices, and it seems like this is happening again. But auditors said even though eligibility is determined by the county departments or Division of Social Services, it's NCDHHS that's responsible for ensuring that compliance with the eligibility requirements. So even though the county is handling it, it's up to the Department of Health and Human Services to actually make sure everything is being implemented correctly.
It's a lengthy story we've got this morning. A lot of figures, details, and numbers are available on our website, carolinajournal.com. Theresa Opeka joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:47, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at the roadways this morning, an update on traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
5:53. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Taking a look at some additional statewide news this morning. As we mentioned yesterday, the North Carolina General Assembly is on their spring break, so we'll not see any new legislation moving this week. However, there was a lot of ongoings over the last couple of weeks. The North Carolina House passed two bipartisan bills last week to remove educational barriers for veterans, active duty service members, and their families in an effort to honor military service and strengthen the state's workforce. House Bill 69, titled Military and Veterans Educational Promise Act, allows UNC system students who joined the military to defer their admissions for up to 5 years if they are active duty, or 2 years if they are a reserve or National Guard. It also grants in-state tuition to veterans who graduated from a North Carolina high school, were stationed in the state for 90 days, or received the Purple Heart, expanding the GI benefits for veterans. The bill is sponsored by an all-veteran and bipartisan group of lawmakers, including State Representative Grant Campbell from Cabarrus, Alan Chesser from Nash, Kelly Hastings from Gaston, and Dante Pittman from Wilson. According to Representative Campbell, he said, quote, "This bill will make sure that any of those men and women who, on one hand, hold an acceptance to their dream school and, on the other hand, love their service to their country, that they don't have to make a choice between the two." House Bill 373 is the UNC tuition discount for certain students. It allows the UNC system to discount tuition for students with military or employer tuition assistance, potentially reducing costs to zero. With over 90% of eligible students currently studying out of state, the bill could retain talent and generate worth upwards of $20 million in UNC revenue. The bill was filed at the request of the UNC system, who, well, in fact, requested this themselves. Representative Ray Pickett from Watauga County said, quote, "North Carolina has a rich military history. We have had some for some long time. I believe that we can do everything we can to support our veterans, and this is a step in the right direction to further their education and hopefully get them to stay right here in our home state. Many of them serve here and they'd like to call here home, but this gives us the opportunity to give them something that they can come back to when they get here, get back into regular civilian life, and be productive members of our society." With strong bipartisan support and the UNC system's backing, both of these bills now make their way to the North Carolina Senate. As I mentioned, pretty broad bipartisan support on both these, House Bill 69 and House Bill 373. Those continue to make their way through the North Carolina General Assembly. They are now in the Senate. We'll keep an eye on those details as well. Turning our attention back to our big story this morning, the two candidates in North Carolina's unresolved state Supreme Court race, the State Board of Elections, Justice Allison Riggs, Judge Jefferson Griffin, all had a deadline yesterday to file various legal opinions and briefs before a federal trial judge in a hearing that will take place in this case, or at least that's what Democrat candidate Allison Riggs, the Democrat Party, and left of center activist groups are all urging the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to step into that dispute. Without their intervention, U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers will decide whether to block a process that state courts have spelled out for resolving the election dispute between Riggs and Griffin. Potentially as many as 5,700 of Griffin's original 65,000 challenged ballots remain in dispute. That is a very different number from what the State Board of Election claims. They're only apparently looking at about 1,600 or so ballots that could be affected. We are waiting for some additional details from the State Board and some additional movement from U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers ahead of this Fourth U.S. Circuit decision. A lot of moving parts in this case. We'll continue to keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour and our website, carolinajournal.com. Well, that's going to do it for a Tuesday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.